The humid August air hung thick over the Florida Everglades like a suffocating blanket that refused to lift even as evening approached. Detective Ray Martinez had seen plenty in his 23 years with the Broward County Sheriff's Office, but nothing quite prepared him for the sight that greeted him along the murky waters of Canal 37 on that sweltering Tuesday afternoon in 2022. The call had come in at 3:47, a routine report from the county drainage crew performing their monthly maintenance sweep. What they found would crack open a case that had been gathering dust in the cold files for 55 long years. Standing knee-deep in the brackish water, Martinez watched as the crane operator carefully maneuvered the rusted hulk of what had once been a pristine 1966 Harley-Davidson Electra Glide onto the canal bank. Water poured from every crevice of the machine, carrying with it decades of sediment, algae, and the unmistakable stench of decay. The motorcycle's chrome had long since surrendered to corrosion, its once brilliant blue paint job now a mottled canvas of rust and barnacle scars. But what made Martinez's pulse quicken was not the condition of the bike itself, but what remained intact despite its underwater tomb. The leather saddlebags, though darkened by their aquatic imprisonment, had somehow survived. The quality craftsmanship of genuine cowhide and brass fittings had created a seal that time and water had failed to breach completely. As the motorcycle settled onto the muddy bank with a wet thud that seemed to echo across the surrounding sawgrass, Martinez could see the telltale bulge of contents still secured within those weathered pouches. His mind immediately flashed to the missing persons report that had haunted the department's oldest detectives, the case of James Franklin Holloway, private investigator extraordinaire, who had vanished without a trace on September 15, 1967. The disappearance of Jimmy Holloway had become something of a legend in South Florida law enforcement circles, passed down from veteran to rookie, like a ghost story told around the station house coffee pot. Here was a man who had made his living finding other people's secrets, tracking down cheating spouses and runaway teenagers, uncovering insurance fraud and corporate malfeasance with the tenacity of a bloodhound and the street smarts of a con artist. Yet, when he himself vanished, every lead went cold, every witness claimed ignorance, and every theory crumbled under scrutiny. Martinez pulled out his cell phone and dialed the number for Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the Miami-Dade Police Department's Cold Case Division, knowing this discovery would require interagency cooperation given the likelihood that Holloway's investigation had crossed county lines. As he waited for her to answer, he studied the motorcycle more closely, noting the Florida license plate still barely visible beneath layers of aquatic growth. The numbers and letters were illegible, but the distinctive orange and black color scheme was unmistakably from the mid-1960s era. When Chen's voice crackled through the speaker, Martinez felt a familiar thrill of anticipation that came with breaking a case wide open. "Lieutenant, this is Martinez down at Canal 37 in Broward. You need to get down here right away. I think we just found Jimmy Holloway's bike." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before Chen responded, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Are you certain? After all this time?" The description matches perfectly. 66 Electra Glide, blue and chrome, leather saddlebags, and Sarah. The bags appear intact. Whatever Jimmy was carrying when he disappeared might still be recoverable. Within an hour, Canal 37 resembled a crime scene from a major network television drama. Evidence technicians swarmed over the motorcycle like archaeologists examining a precious artifact, photographing every angle, cataloging every detail, preparing to transport their find back to the forensics laboratory where the real investigation could begin. Chen arrived with a manila folder thick with documents, witness statements, and photographs that had been accumulated over the decades whenever someone claimed to have new information about the missing private eye. As Martinez watched the carefully orchestrated dance of evidence, collection, his thoughts turned to the man who had owned this machine, who had ridden it through the streets of Miami and beyond in pursuit of truth and justice for hire. James Franklin Holloway had been 34 years old when he disappeared, a former military police officer who had parlayed his investigative skills into a successful private practice. According to the original case files, he had been working several cases simultaneously at the time of his disappearance, including a missing persons case involving a wealthy businessman's daughter, a workers' compensation fraud investigation for a major insurance company, and what appeared to be a routine adultery case for a prominent attorney's wife. The mystery had deepened when investigators discovered that Holloway had withdrawn $8,000 from his business account on the morning of September 13, 1967, telling his secretary that he was following up on a promising lead and would be back within 48 hours. His final documented activities occurred on September 14th, when witnesses reported seeing him at various locations around Miami, apparently conducting surveillance and meeting with informants. That was the last time anyone admitted to seeing him alive. His apartment had been undisturbed, his personal effects left behind. His other vehicle, a 1964 Ford Mustang, still parked in its designated space behind his downtown Miami office building. Detective Chen opened the thick file and began reviewing the witness statements that had been collected in the immediate aftermath of Holloway's disappearance. His secretary, Margaret Flanders, had been the last person to speak with him officially, describing him as excited about a breakthrough in one of his cases, but refusing to provide specifics. She had found it unusual that he would take such a large sum of cash, as Holloway was typically very careful about financial transactions and maintained meticulous records of all business expenses. The original investigating officers had interviewed dozens of people connected to Holloway's active cases, from the worried parents of the missing girl to the insurance adjusters who had hired him to investigate suspicious claims. Each interview had yielded fragments of information, but no coherent picture of what might have happened to the private investigator. Some witnesses suggested that Holloway had been acting nervous in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, looking over his shoulder and making cryptic comments about being close to uncovering something significant. Others insisted that he had seemed perfectly normal, professional, and confident as always. As the afternoon wore on and the evidence collection continued, Martinez found himself studying the case photographs that Chen had brought with her. Holloway had been a handsome man in the classic 1960s style, with thick, dark hair carefully styled, penetrating brown eyes, and the kind of confident smile that could charm information out of reluctant witnesses. He had been 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing approximately 170 pounds, with no distinguishing scars or tattoos. The photographs showed him in various settings around his office, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits that spoke of success and professionalism. One particular photograph caught Martinez's attention, a candid shot taken at some social function showing Holloway deep in conversation with a stunning blonde woman whose face was partially obscured by shadow. According to the notation on the back, the photograph had been found among Holloway's personal effects, but no one had been able to identify the woman or determine the significance of the image. Chen noticed Martinez studying the photograph and moved closer to examine it herself. "Every detective who's worked this case has wondered about her," Chen said, pointing to the mysterious woman. Margaret Flanders claimed she'd never seen her before, and none of Holloway's known associates could identify her either. Could be a client, could be personal, could be completely unrelated to his disappearance. That's the problem with this case. There are too many variables and not enough solid evidence. The forensics team had finished their preliminary examination of the motorcycle and was preparing to transport it to the laboratory for more detailed analysis. Martinez watched as they carefully lifted each saddlebag, noting the weight and apparent integrity of the leather despite its long submersion. The brass buckles and hardware showed significant corrosion, but the bags themselves appeared to have maintained their basic structure. Whatever secrets Jimmy Holloway had been carrying on that fateful September day might finally be revealed. Though the passage of 5.5 decades would present significant challenges for evidence recovery. As the sun began to set over the Everglades, casting long shadows across the canal where the motorcycle had rested for more than half a century, Martinez found himself wondering about the circumstances that had led to this moment. Had Holloway been murdered and his body disposed of elsewhere while his motorcycle was dumped in the canal? Had he staged his own disappearance and somehow lost control of his bike in the process? Or was there a more complex explanation that would only become clear once the saddlebags were opened and their contents examined? The drive back to headquarters gave Martinez time to review what he knew about the geography of the Everglades and the surrounding area in 1967. At that time, much of what was now developed suburban sprawl had been undeveloped wetlands and agricultural fields. Canal 37 had been part of an extensive drainage system designed to control flooding during the hurricane season, but it had also served as a convenient dumping ground for everything from construction, debris to stolen vehicles. The fact that Holloway's motorcycle had remained undiscovered for so long was not particularly surprising given the remote location and the tendency of submerged objects to become buried in sediment over time. Back at the Broward County Station, Martinez coordinated with Chen to assemble a joint task force to review the Holloway case files and prepare for whatever revelations might emerge from the forensic examination of the motorcycle and its contents. The original case detectives had long since retired or passed away, but their meticulous documentation provided a solid foundation for reopening the investigation. Each piece of evidence would need to be re-examined in light of modern forensic techniques and compared against whatever materials had survived in those mysterious saddlebags. The forensics laboratory was located in a nondescript building on the outskirts of Fort Lauderdale. Its sterile white corridors and climate-controlled examination rooms, a stark contrast to the humid chaos of the crime scene at Canal 37. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the chief forensic examiner, had been briefed on the significance of the motorcycle discovery and had cleared her schedule to personally oversee the analysis. As Martinez and Chen watched through an observation window, Valdez and her team began the delicate process of examining the first saddlebag. The leather had been softened by its aquatic environment, but had not completely deteriorated, allowing the technicians to carefully work the corroded buckles free without causing additional damage. As the flap of the first bag was lifted, revealing its contents for the first time in 55 years, Martinez held his breath in anticipation. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be multiple layers of oiled canvas and heavy-duty plastic, were several manila envelopes, a leather-bound notebook, and what looked like documents in protective sleeves. Dr. Valdez worked with the patience of a surgeon, carefully extracting each item and placing it in a sterile examination tray. The multiple layers of protective wrapping had provided crucial protection against water damage, and while some deterioration was evident, much of the material appeared to be in better condition than anyone had dared hope. The manila envelopes contained what appeared to be documents, photographs, and handwritten notes, while the leather notebook showed signs of extensive use, its pages filled with Holloway's distinctive handwriting. The second saddlebag yielded even more intriguing contents. including a small revolver wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth and plastic sheeting, several rolls of cash that had been similarly protected, and a manila envelope marked "Insurance Confidential" in Holloway's careful script. Martinez felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were looking at what might be the complete case files that Holloway had been working on at the time of his disappearance, preserved like a time capsule from an era when private investigators relied on shoe leather and instinct rather than computer databases and digital surveillance. As the evidence was cataloged and prepared for detailed examination, Chen began making phone calls to track down any surviving witnesses from the original investigation. Margaret Flanders, Holloway's secretary, had passed away in 1993, but her daughter still lived in the Miami area and might have heard stories about her mother's experiences with the missing private investigator. Several of Holloway's former clients were still alive, though now well into their 80s and 90s, and might be able to provide additional context for whatever information was contained in the recovered files. The first breakthrough came when Dr. Valdez was able to examine several of the photographs that had been protected in the saddlebags. The images were in remarkably good condition, considering their age and storage conditions, though some showed water damage around the edges. The photographs revealed scenes that would have been scandalous in 1967, but seemed almost quaint by 2022 standards, showing a middle-aged man in compromising positions with a woman who was clearly not his wife. Classic evidence of adultery that would have been valuable currency in divorce proceedings of that era. More intriguing were the handwritten notes in Holloway's notebook, which began to paint a picture of an maibisidio investigation that had grown far more complex than a simple adultery case. References to insurance fraud, missing funds, and dangerous connections suggested that Holloway had stumbled onto something much larger than a cheating husband. One particular entry, dated September 12, 1967, read, "Meeting with informant set for tomorrow night. Says he has proof of the connection between the insurance claims and the missing girl. Could be the break we need, but need to be careful. These people don't play games." Martinez studied the notebook entries, trying to piece together the timeline of Holloway's final days. The private investigator had clearly been juggling multiple cases, but there seemed to be connections between them that he was only beginning to understand. References to specific locations around Miami, including several that were now major commercial developments but had been remote areas in 1967, suggested that Holloway had been conducting surveillance and meeting with informants in isolated locations throughout his final week. The manila envelope marked "Insurance Confidential" contained documentation that would have been explosive in its day, revealing a complex scheme involving fraudulent workers' compensation claims, staged accidents, and corrupt medical professionals who provided false documentation to support bogus injury claims. The scheme appeared to involve hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent claims, a substantial sum for the 1960s that would be equivalent to several million in today's currency. The names on the documents included several prominent business leaders and even a few political figures who were still well known in South Florida decades later, though most were now deceased. As Martinez read through the insurance fraud documentation, he began to understand why Jimmy Holloway might have been considered a threat to powerful interests. The scheme described in his notes involved a network of corruption that extended from street-level criminals to white-collar professionals and even included connections to organized crime families that were expanding their operations into South Florida during the rapid development boom of the 1960s. The private investigator had been methodically building a case that could have brought down an entire network of corruption, not realizing that his investigation was placing him in mortal danger. Chen coordinated with the district attorney's office to determine whether any of the crimes documented in Holloway's files were still within the statute of limitations for prosecution. While most of the fraud cases were too old to pursue criminally, the information might still be valuable for understanding what had happened to the investigator himself. If Holloway had been murdered to prevent his findings from becoming public, his killer or killers might still be alive and subject to prosecution for homicide, which had no statute of limitations. The forensic examination of the motorcycle itself revealed additional clues about the circumstances of its submersion. Damage patterns on the frame and engine suggested that the bike had been deliberately pushed or driven into the canal rather than accidentally ending up in the water. Microscopic analysis of paint chips and metal fragments found embedded in the frame indicated that the motorcycle had been in contact with another vehicle shortly before it entered the water, possibly during a collision or struggle. However, the extended underwater exposure made it impossible to recover biological evidence that could be definitively linked to specific individuals. Dr. Valdez's team also discovered trace evidence on several surfaces of the motorcycle, including fabric fibers and other materials that might provide clues about the circumstances of its submersion. While the degradation caused by 55 years underwater made definitive analysis challenging, the evidence suggested that the motorcycle had been in contact with materials consistent with a struggle or violent confrontation before entering the canal. As the investigation progressed, Martinez began reaching out to retired law enforcement officers who had worked in the Miami area during the 1960s and 70s. One name that kept appearing in the old case files was Detective Frank Morrison, who had been the lead investigator on Holloway's disappearance and had continued working the case unofficially even after his retirement in 1985. Morrison was now 83 years old and living in a retirement community in Fort Lauderdale, but his memory of the case remained sharp. "I always knew we'd find that bike someday," Morrison told Martinez during their first phone conversation. "Jimmy was too smart to just vanish without a trace unless someone made him disappear. That motorcycle was his pride and joy, and he would never have abandoned it voluntarily. We searched every canal, every lake, every swamp within 50 miles of Miami, but the Everglades were so vast and the canals so numerous that we couldn't cover everything." Morrison agreed to meet with Martinez and Chen to review the recovered evidence and share his insights from the original investigation. Despite his advanced age, the retired detective's recollections were remarkably detailed, and he was able to provide context for many of the names and locations mentioned in Holloway's notes. He also revealed information that had never been included in the official case files, including his suspicions about corruption within various law enforcement agencies that might have compromised the original investigation. There were people who didn't want Jimmy's cases solved, Morrison explained during their meeting at the retirement community's coffee shop. Important people with connections to City Hall and the county courthouse. I was told more than once to let sleeping dogs lie, that pursuing certain leads would be bad for my career. I ignored those warnings as much as I could, but I think Jimmy's disappearance sent a message that even I couldn't completely ignore. The meeting with Morrison provided crucial insights into the political and social climate of Miami in the late 1960s, when the city was experiencing rapid growth and development that created opportunities for corruption and organized crime. The insurance fraud scheme documented in Holloway's files was apparently just one part of a larger network of illegal activities that included money laundering, political bribery, and connections to organized crime families from the Northeast, who were expanding their operations into South Florida to take advantage of the region's growth and relatively weak law enforcement presence. Morrison also provided important information about the mysterious blonde woman in the photograph found among Holloway's personal effects. According to the E2E retired detective, she was believed to be connected to one of the prominent businessmen implicated in the insurance fraud scheme, possibly serving as a liaison between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. Several witnesses had mentioned seeing her in the company of various suspects, but she had never been formally identified or interviewed, and her current whereabouts remained unknown. As the forensic analysis continued, additional evidence emerged that supported the theory that Holloway had been murdered to prevent his investigation from becoming public. The revolver found in the saddlebags showed evidence of having been recently cleaned and maintained before the motorcycle entered the canal, suggesting that Holloway had been prepared for trouble and might have anticipated a confrontation with dangerous individuals. The presence of the weapon indicated that the private investigator had been aware of the risks associated with his investigation and had taken precautions to protect himself. The handwritten notes in Holloway's notebook became increasingly urgent and paranoid in the days leading up to his disappearance, suggesting that he was aware of being watched and possibly followed. One entry, dated September 11th, just 4 days before he vanished, read, "They know I'm getting close. Changed hotels twice this week. Margaret doesn't know where I'm staying. The meeting could be dangerous, but it's the only way to get the final proof we need. If something happens to me, everything important is in the saddlebags." This entry proved to be prophetic, as it appeared that Holloway had indeed prepared for the possibility of his own death by securing his most important evidence in the waterproof protection of his motorcycle's saddlebags. The private investigator had apparently hoped that even if he was killed, his research would eventually be discovered and the truth would emerge. He could never have imagined that it would take 55 years for his carefully preserved evidence to see the light of day. Chen assembled a team of detectives to follow up on the leads contained in Holloway's files, focusing on individuals who were still alive and might have information about the events of 1967. While most of the primary suspects had died of natural causes over the intervening decades, several of their associates and family members were still living in the South Florida area and could potentially provide additional information about the insurance fraud scheme and its connection to Holloway's disappearance. The breakthrough came when detectives interviewed Eleanor Vasquez, the 84-year-old widow of Roberto Vasquez, who had been mentioned several times in Holloway's notes as a key figure in the insurance fraud operation. Mrs. Vasquez initially claimed to know nothing about her late husband's business activities, insisting that he had been a legitimate businessman who ran a small construction company. However, when confronted with specific evidence from the recovered files, she became visibly distressed and admitted that she had been carrying the burden of terrible knowledge for more than half a century. According to Mrs. Vasquez, her husband had been approached by representatives of a Miami-based crime family in the mid-1960s and coerced into participating in the insurance fraud scheme through a combination of financial incentives and threats against his family. When Jimmy Holloway began investigating the fraudulent claims, Roberto Vasquez had been ordered to arrange a meeting with the private investigator under the pretense of providing information that would help solve one of his missing persons cases. Instead, the meeting had been a trap designed to eliminate Holloway before he could expose the entire operation. Mrs. Vasquez's testimony provided crucial details about the circumstances of Holloway's death, including the location where the meeting had taken place and the identities of several individuals who had been involved in planning and carrying out the murder. According to her account, Holloway had been lured to a remote area near the western edge of the Everglades on the evening of September 14, 1967, where he was confronted by armed men who demanded that he turn over all evidence related to his insurance fraud investigation and cease his inquiries into their activities. When Holloway refused to cooperate and attempted to escape on his motorcycle, he was pursued and eventually cornered near Canal 37. During the confrontation, shots were fired, and Holloway was mortally wounded. His body was disposed of in a different location deep within the Everglades, while his motorcycle was pushed into the canal to eliminate physical evidence that might connect the crime to his killers. The plan had been partially successful, as Holloway's body was never found and the original investigation had stalled due to lack of evidence and the intimidation of potential witnesses. Mrs. Vasquez identified 3 men who had been directly involved in Holloway's murder, though 2 had died of natural causes in the intervening decades. The third man, Anthony "Tony" Marconi, was reportedly still alive at age 79, but had been living under an assumed name and suffering from advanced dementia for several years. Marconi had been a mid-level enforcer for the crime family and had reportedly been present during the confrontation that resulted in Holloway's death, though Mrs. Vasquez was uncertain about which specific individual had actually fired the fatal shots. The identification of Marconi as a surviving participant in Holloway's murder presented both an opportunity and a challenge for the modern investigation. While he was still alive and could potentially be prosecuted for murder, his advanced age and deteriorating mental condition due to dementia made it unlikely that he would be competent to stand trial or able to provide reliable testimony about events from 55 years earlier. However, his presence provided an opportunity to finally close one of South Florida's oldest unsolved cases and bring some measure of justice to the memory of Jimmy Holloway. Martinez and Chen traveled to Naples to interview Marconi, accompanied by a representative from the state attorney's office and a geriatric psychiatrist who would evaluate his mental competency. The nursing home where Marconi resided was a modern facility that specialized in caring for elderly patients with various forms of cognitive impairment, and the staff was initially reluctant to allow the interview due to concerns about their patient's fragile mental state and the potential psychological impact of discussing traumatic events from his distant past. The man they found bore little resemblance to the dangerous criminal described in law enforcement records from the 1960s and 70s. Marconi appeared frail and confused, struggling to remember events from the recent past while occasionally displaying moments of clarity about incidents from decades earlier. When questioned about Jimmy Holloway, he initially claimed to have no memory of the name or the events surrounding the private investigator's disappearance, though he became noticeably agitated when shown photographs of the recovered motorcycle. However, as the interview progressed and specific details from the case were mentioned, Marconi began to display signs of recognition and increasing distress. When shown photographs of Holloway and documents related to the insurance fraud investigation, the elderly man became increasingly agitated and began muttering fragmented statements about the detective and orders from the family. While his statements were often incoherent and difficult to follow, they provided enough corroboration of Mrs. Vasquez's account to support the theory that he had been directly involved in the events leading to Holloway's death. The psychiatric evaluation concluded that while Marconi suffered from moderate to severe dementia, he retained sufficient awareness of right and wrong to potentially face criminal charges. However, the practical reality was that his condition made it highly unlikely that he would live long enough to see a trial concluded, and even if he did, his mental state would make it difficult to achieve a meaningful conviction that would satisfy the requirements of justice for both the EIB, victim, and society. Despite these challenges, the state attorney's office decided to file murder charges against Marconi, both to provide closure for the case and to send a message that there was no statute of limitations on justice for homicide victims. The charges were largely symbolic, given Marconi's condition and advanced age, but they represented an important acknowledgement that Jimmy Holloway's death had been a crime that deserved official recognition and prosecution. Marconi died peacefully in his sleep just 6 weeks after being formally indicted, taking any remaining details about Jimmy Holloway's murder to his grave and leaving investigators to piece together the final elements of the story from the evidence and testimony they had already collected. The resolution of the Holloway case brought closure to a mystery that had haunted South Florida law enforcement for more than 5 decades. But it also raised troubling questions about how many other crimes from that era had been covered up by corruption and intimidation. The insurance fraud scheme that had cost Jimmy Holloway his life was just one example of the widespread organized crime activities that had flourished in Miami during the city's rapid growth period in the 1960s and 70s, when weak law enforcement and rampant political corruption had created a virtual paradise for criminal enterprises. Chen organized a press conference to announce the resolution of the case, drawing media attention from across the country as reporters and true crime enthusiasts learned about the private investigator who had paid the ultimate price for his dedication to uncovering the truth. The story of Jimmy Holloway's motorcycle emerging from its watery grave after 55 years captured the public imagination, serving as a powerful reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through persistence and modern investigative techniques. The forensic examination of Holloway's recovered evidence also led to renewed interest in several other unsolved cases from the same era, as investigators realized that the private investigator's meticulous documentation might contain clues to additional crimes that had never been properly investigated. His files referenced several missing persons cases that had never been solved, including the disappearance of Rebecca Santos, a wealthy businessman's daughter whose case had brought Holloway into contact with the criminal network that ultimately cost him his life. Martinez found himself personally invested in following up on these additional leads, driven by his professional commitment to solving cold cases and his admiration for Holloway's dedication to his work. Rebecca Santos had been 19 years old when she disappeared in August of 1967, just weeks before Holloway himself vanished. Her father, construction magnate Eduardo Santos, had hired the private investigator to find his daughter. After the police investigation had stalled due to lack of leads and what appeared to be deliberate obstruction by individuals connected to organized crime, Holloway's notes suggested that he had developed a theory connecting Rebecca's disappearance to the insurance fraud scheme, possibly as leverage against her father or as collateral damage from his investigation into organized crime activities. References in the recovered files to "The Girl Knows Too Much" and "Insurance for Insurance" suggested that Rebecca might have stumbled upon information about illegal activities and been eliminated to prevent her from exposing the truth or cooperating with law enforcement investigators. The renewed investigation into Rebecca Santos's disappearance benefited from advances in forensic science and database technology that had been unavailable to investigators in 1967. Physical evidence recovered from items in her bedroom, which had been preserved by her family as a shrine to their missing daughter, could now be analyzed using modern techniques and compared against samples from unidentified remains found throughout South Florida over the intervening decades. The search for Rebecca Santos also revealed additional information about the extent of organized crime influence in Miami during the late 1960s, as investigators discovered that several prominent businessmen and political figures had been under surveillance by both law enforcement and criminal organizations. The construction industry, in particular, had been heavily infiltrated by crime families who used legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering and other illegal activities, while also providing cover for more violent crimes such as murder and extortion. Eduardo Santos, Rebecca's father, had died in 1994 without ever learning what had happened to his daughter. But his surviving family members remained hopeful that the renewed investigation might finally provide answers. His son, Roberto Santos, now a successful attorney in his 70s, had never given up searching for his sister and had maintained reward offers and hired private investigators periodically over the decades, though none had been able to uncover the truth that had cost Jimmy Holloway his life. The discovery of Jimmy Holloway's files also shed new light on the corruption within law enforcement that had hampered the original investigations. References to specific police officers and detectives who had been compromised by organized crime provided a roadmap for understanding how cases had been manipulated and evidence had disappeared. While most of the corrupt officials were now deceased, their actions had contributed to a climate of impunity that had allowed criminal organizations to operate with relative freedom, and had made it possible for murderers like those who killed Holloway to escape justice for decades. Martinez found himself reflecting on the parallels between modern law enforcement and the challenges faced by investigators in the 1960s, recognizing that while technology had advanced significantly, the fundamental problems of corruption, intimidation, and political interference remained constant threats to the pursuit of justice. The story of Jimmy Holloway served as both an inspiration and a warning about the dangers faced by those who chose to confront powerful criminal interests without adequate support and protection from law. Enforcement institutions. The public response to the resolution of the Holloway case was overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing admiration for the private investigator's dedication to his work and his foresight in preserving evidence that would eventually lead to the truth. Social media posts and online forums dedicated to true crime discussions featured extensive analysis of the case, with amateur investigators attempting to identify additional connections and unsolved mysteries that might be related to Holloway's work and the broader criminal network that had been exposed through his investigation. The Miami-Dade County Sheriff's Office received numerous tips and leads from people claiming to have information about other cases from the same era, though most proved to be either mistaken memories or attempts to gain attention from the media coverage surrounding the Holloway case. However, several tips did provide valuable information about organized crime activities in South Florida during the 1960s and 70s, leading to renewed interest in cold cases that had been considered unsolvable and opening new avenues for investigation into historical criminal activities. Dr. Valdez and her forensic team continued their analysis of evidence recovered from the motorcycle, using advanced techniques to extract additional information from materials that had been damaged by their long submersion but still retained traces of valuable evidence. Microscopic. Examination of fabric fibers, soil samples, and other trace evidence provided clues about locations where Holloway had traveled in his final days, helping investigators reconstruct his movements and identify potential witnesses who might still be alive and able to provide testimony about their observations from 55 years earlier. The leather notebook found in the saddlebags proved to be particularly valuable, as Holloway's handwriting revealed details about his investigative methods and sources of information that had not been documented in his official case files. His notes described surveillance techniques, interview strategies, and analytical methods that were sophisticated for their era, and demonstrated the private investigator's professional competence and attention to detail. The notebook also contained personal observations and reflections that provided insight into Holloway's character and his commitment to seeking justice for his clients, despite the obvious dangers he faced. One particularly intriguing aspect of Holloway's notes was his apparent awareness of being watched and followed in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He had documented specific incidents of surveillance, including descriptions of vehicles that had appeared repeatedly near his office and apartment, and individuals who had seemed to be monitoring his activities. This information suggested that his killers had been planning his elimination for some time before carrying out their plan, and that Holloway had been increasingly aware of the danger he faced as his investigation progressed. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Holloway had been working to protect himself and his evidence, including the use of safety deposit boxes, secure storage facilities, and coded communication systems that were quite advanced for a private investigator operating in the pre-computer era. His preparation for the possibility of his own death demonstrated both his professional paranoia and his commitment to ensuring that his work would survive even if he did not. A foresight that ultimately proved crucial to solving his own murder 5.5 decades later. As the investigation wound down and the various legal proceedings were concluded, Martinez found himself thinking about the broader implications of the case for modern law enforcement. The 55-year delay in solving Jimmy Holloway's murder illustrated both the challenges faced by investigators working without modern technology and the importance of persistence in pursuing justice for crime victims, even when cases seemed hopeless and witnesses were scattered or deceased. The case also highlighted the important role that private investigators had played in law enforcement during an era when police resources were limited and corruption was more widespread than in modern times. Holloway's work had filled important gaps in the official investigation of organized crime activities, though his efforts had ultimately cost him his life when he uncovered information that powerful interests were willing to kill to protect. Chen organized a memorial service for Jimmy Holloway, attended by law enforcement officers, private investigators, and members of the public who had been moved by his story and inspired by his dedication to justice. The service was held at a small chapel in Miami, not far from where Holloway's office had been located in 1967, and featured speakers who talked about his dedication to justice and his ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of the truth. The ceremony provided a sense of closure for the many people who had been touched by the case and served as a reminder of the price that some individuals pay in the service of justice and truth. The recovered motorcycle was eventually donated to a law enforcement museum, where it would serve as a reminder of both the dangers faced by those who investigate organized crime and the importance of preserving evidence for future generations of investigators. The saddlebags and their contents were retained as evidence in ongoing investigations related to other cases that had been connected to the insurance fraud scheme and the broader criminal network that had been exposed through Holloway's work. Martinez continued working on related cases, using information from Holloway's files to investigate other disappearances and unsolved crimes from the same era. While most of the perpetrators were now deceased, the evidence provided valuable intelligence about organized crime activities that helped modern investigators understand historical patterns and connections that continued to influence criminal organizations in South Florida. The work also served as a tribute to Jimmy Holloway's memory and a continuation of the investigation that had cost him his life. The story of Jimmy Holloway's motorcycle emerging from Canal 37 after 55 years became a symbol of the persistence of truth and the eventual triumph of justice over corruption and intimidation. While the private investigator himself had paid the ultimate price for his dedication to his work, his carefully preserved evidence had finally achieved the goal he had died pursuing: exposing the truth and bringing his killers to account for their crimes, even if that justice came decades later than it should have. The case served as an inspiration to current and future investigators, demonstrating that dedication to justice and attention to detail could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, could eventually emerge to serve the cause of justice. Jimmy Holloway's legacy lived on not only in the resolution of his own murder, but in the additional cases that were solved using information from his recovered files and in the renewed commitment to investigating historical crimes that had been forgotten or abandoned. As Martinez filed his final report on the Holloway investigation, He reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a routine canal maintenance operation and ended with the solution of one of South Florida's most enduring mysteries. The discovery of the motorcycle had been pure chance, but the resolution of the case had required the same qualities that had made Jimmy Holloway an effective investigator: persistence, attention to detail, and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth regardless of the personal cost or the time required to achieve justice for victims and their families.